Good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling to order the Coastal Sharks Management Board. The first item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Is there any opposition to the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda is approved by consent. Next is approval of the proceedings from May 2023. Any opposition to approving the proceedings? Seeing none, the proceedings are approved by consent. At this time, we'll take public comment. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to give public comment before the Coastal Sharks Board? No. And there are no hands online, so we'll move forward to item 4. So item 4 is a presentation on scoping for draft amendment 16 to the HMS Fishery Management Plan. We'll have a presentation from Guy, and I clarified this right beforehand, Guy DeBeck from HMS. We'll get that presentation loaded and you're welcome to get started.
Okay. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Guy DeBeck here from the Atlantic HMS Management Division. So I'm here to talk about scoping of Amendment 16. Next slide, please. So first, I want to orient you to some background of two large documents, Amendment 14 and then the Shark Fishery Review document that kind of sets the stage for Amendment 16. And then move on into the scoping document and all the options that we're kind of considering. Next slide. Okay. And background, next slide. Next. So the first one here is Amendment 14, which we put out earlier this year. Again, it was a framework action that kind of sets the stage and implements the ABCs and ACLs for the Atlantic shark fisheries. In there, we had a variety of preferred options. The first one was to create a tiered ABC control rule. The next one was to create a phase in of the ABC control rule for under certain modifications. And then for the ACL development, we're looking to actively manage the recreational and commercial sector ACLs, along with establishing ACLs for different shark management groups without quota linkages. The next one was we could, for any carryover or under harvest of the commercial quota under certain conditions. And the last one is we're gonna look at a 3-year kind of rolling average of mortality to determine the overfishing stock status. Next slide. So the other big document we released earlier this year was our Shark Fishery Review, or SHARE document. This was kind of our complete review of the shark fishery, looking at the commercial and recreational conservation and management measures, along with depredation. Another part in the document we looked at was the external factors that are affecting the shark fishery, mostly CITES listings, and then also the state and now the national shark fin bans. From that, we kind of determined that management measures that are working well, or some concerns with the different management measures, but then overall, from there, we looked at how we move forward and provided some suggestions of what management measures we can move forward with. Next slide. And from those, we kind of formulated the scoping for Amendment 16. Next slide. So yeah, so in May, we released Amendment 16. From here, the objective is to kind of consistent with the Amendment 14 and scientific advice to establish ABCs and ACLs for the non-predatory shark species. We want to try and optimize the commercial and recreational quotas for fishermen to harvest, and also increase management flexibility for us to kind of react to the changes that are occurring real time. Next slide. So here is kind of a slide based on Amendment 14. We did the tiered ABC control rule. From there, we were establishing it based on the data from the assessments to determine which species we're going to place in each tier. And we have 4 tiers. We have tier 1 is data rich stock assessments. Tier 2 is the data moderate. Tier 3 is the data limited. And then the tier 4 are the ones that have not been assessed. You can also see we have 2 tiers outside the ABC control rule, and those are stocks under rebuilding plan, and then the ones that are ICAT or pelagic shark species. I just want to point out that you'll see the green highlighted ones. In our scoping document, we did an example of what the ABC and ACLs could be for those species with commercial and recreational ACLs. In the document, so the ones highlighted, we have a more detailed of what it may look like in the document. But also want to point out that you see the red asterisk with the hammerhead shark assessment. We're currently working on that right now, and we're hoping to have that done sometime this coming year. But once that's completed, we'll be moving the hammerhead species around within or outside the tier process, depending what the results are. But I also want to point out that's true for all of our shark stocks. Once we get more scientific data and have assessments, we'll be moving them around. So it's going to be kind of fluid of what it looks like here. Next slide. So here I just want to orient you to with in Amendment 14, we set up the ACL framework for non-predated shark species. It just kind of orients you to this kind of tree process that we set up and how we're going to be going through it in the future slides about looking at what an example may look like. So again, we have the OFL, we'll have an OFL or OFL proxy, ABC or ABC proxy, and then the ACLs for our shark stocks, and then we'll have the different sector ACLs too. Next slide, please. So I want to show you at least one example of what it may look like. For this group here, it shows the tier 1, so data rich assessment, and we did the black tip sharks in the Atlantic region. Also just want to highlight that we're for this tier here, for this chart here, we made some assumptions. We're using all the catch history, and in our document we were looking at, we have options of what kind of catch history do we use? Do we use all of our catch history to kind of split the ACL between the commercial and recreational, or do we want to look at more recent years in the last 5 or 10 years? But in this one, we're using all of it. And also with the HMS risk policy. Historically, we've used 70% for majority of our shark stocks as the risk policy to ensure that they're healthy stocks and we're not going to cause overfishing, or overfishing will continue. So we've kind of used 70%, but since we have this example here with Atlantic blacktip and it's tier 1, the scientific certainty for that stock is much lower than other ones. So maybe we could consider other risk policy percentages, and the document would kind of look at whether you're looking at 60 or 50% or sticking with 70%. So for this example here, we looked at 70% and just kind of run through what the OFL and the ABC would be for the Atlantic blacktip sharks. And then we kind of did estimate what the management buffer would be, and then calculate what the ACL would be. So using all the catch history for this one, the recreational sector ACL for Atlantic blacktips would get 58% of that ACL, and their recreational sector quota would be 50,000 sharks, and they would currently rate about past couple of years are averaging about harvesting about 89% of that. For the commercial sector, they're going to get 42% of the ACL, and looking at the commercial quota of 136 metric tons. Recently, in the past couple of years, they've only harvested about 40% of that. Next slide. So since we're talking about changing the ABCs and the ACLs and all the quotas and kind of everything for our shark fishery, we're looking at, what other things can we change for our fishery and moving forward. And it's kind of all connected. And the first thing is looking at the shark manager groups. So historically, we've had those for the longest time where we have large coastal, small coastal, or pelagics. And then as we've doing stock assessments, we've been pulling species out, but kind of keeping them, the other ones grouped together as aggregate large coastal or non-black nose small coastals. So maybe it's time for us to reevaluate that. Maybe we should look at creating different manager groups based on the assessed and unassessed, whether regional or non-regional. But then also look at what species are being caught together. We've been hearing a lot about, if I'm going out shark fishing, I'm catching, black tip bulls and spinners together. So maybe we create a black tip spinner bull quota for the fishermen that are kind of going out catching those things. So again, there's possibilities, it might simplify some regulations, but then also could complicate some of our management measures moving forward with doing that. So just some options in the document. Next slide, please. So then we're moving on to the regionals and sub-regional quotas. Historically, we've kind of split the Atlantic and Gulf region for management purposes and for some stocks. So maybe it's time for us to look at that split, maybe look at more recent catch history and change those quotas based on recent catch history. And then we have the Atlantic Blacknose management boundary line, where we've put that in place about 10 years ago. And again, now that sharks are kind of migrating more north and north, maybe it's not appropriate. Maybe we should look at that line again. And then the other thing was in the Gulf of Mexico, we have sub-regional quotas for management purposes. Maybe it's time for us to reevaluate that, especially if we're looking at the quotas. And, in the document, we talk about the Gulf of Mexico black tip quota could be 16 million pounds. Maybe we shouldn't have we don't need a regional split for that one. So just some options about that. And then the last one here about the Caribbean region. Historically, all the landings from the Caribbean region of sharks come off the Gulf quota, but we know that the Caribbean just operates very differently between how the gears are used, what species they can retain. Maybe it's time for us to create a regional quota for the Caribbean. Next slide. So as we're changing the quotas, maybe it's time for us to also look at our exempted fishing permit quotas and also the shark research fishery. So those have been kind of established for many years, and the usage of those quotas are very low. For the EFPs, we are already going to be taking the research mortality off the top with the framework and based on the framework under the management buffer. So maybe we just rework the quotas around to look at more prohibited species and create a prohibited species quota. For the shark research fishery, we've had that in place since 2008. Unfortunately, I hate to say this, we've had record low participation this year and effort levels, and it's declined for the past couple of years. We feel the research fishery is very vital for our stock assessments now and in the future. So we're trying to come up with ways on how do we keep that, maybe changing the goals, the objectives, to try and keep that going to collect that data that we need for those stock assessments. Next slide, please. So as we're changing quotas, one of the things we kind of identified in our shark fishery review document is maybe we should be changing commercial retention limits that we have not looked at in a long time. We're looking at potentially revising it, increasing it, or removing it for some species. Like I mentioned, if we have such a large quota for some of our healthy stocks, maybe we don't need a commercial retention limit for those species because we know that the driver of the fishery is the markets. So just some options we have in the document on how to revise that. Next slide. So the last set of options we have in our document is for the recreational fishery. So right now we have a 54-inch minimum size limit for majority of our shark stocks, so for our hammerheads and makos, and some small coastals. So maybe it's us, maybe after we're looking at our share document, maybe it's more appropriate to set the minimum size for size of maturity for some of the shark species. Some of them are much smaller than 54 inches, some are much larger. So maybe it's kind of bringing up to what it says for size, based on size of maturity. And also for bag limits. I mean, if we have healthy stocks, maybe we can increase bag limits or remove some of them for some of those species. So some of the options we have in our scoping document. Next slide. So this last slide here is kind of highlight some of the overall kind of comments we've been receiving to date. for MEM 16. So generally, there's a lot of support for us to do something for the shark fishery. However, we're finding that there's a lot of things, a lot of options in MEM 16, and it's hard for a lot of people to get their heads wrapped around, because if you're changing one thing, it ripples to the next thing. So it's I feel like it's a little too much. The other ones are, a lot of our constituents feel like we need to make the change now, not in the future. The fishery needs help make those changes now. And then the other thing is the big thing is to help. They would like us to help them create markets to improve the fishery. However, that's kind of beyond the purview of no fisheries, but they would like our help somehow. And then the biggest one we've been hearing a lot, and in all of our actions, is shark depredation is increasing and continues to increase, and is causing an issue. And then the last comment we've been hearing is like, the sharks need more protection, and we should not be looking to remove these regulations or reducing those. We need to be putting more and more for some of these shark species. Next slide, please. So that's kind of MEM 16 really quickly. I have the website up here for folks that want to go back and look at the documents. We have our last webinar this coming Monday, and then the comment period for this action closes on August 18th. Next slide, please. So the last part of this is kind of beyond MEM 16, and then this kind of just came out today, so some of you probably saw the email, is our shark season rule, proposed rule came out. Just want to highlight that we're going to change things moving forward for our shark season rule. So for this one is that we're proposing to automatically open the fishery January 1st under base quotas and the default retention limit. Historically, we've always closed the fishery on December 31st and would not open until we do our next season rule, announcing the quotas and the opening dates and the retention limits. So under this, we're proposing that it just kind of rolls over, automatically opens up with the default and revised retention limit. The other thing is we're revising the default retention limit. So currently right now in our regulations, we have a default limit of 45 large coastals per trip. We're proposing to increase it to 55, the max number we have. And that's based on catch efforts historically of kind of lower for the shark fishery. So we're putting the higher limit as the default limit. And then also we're proposing to revise quota based on the current regulations to carry over underused quota. Next slide. And the end of it here is just we have the comment period for the shark season rule, ends on September 1st. And if you want to place a comment, we put the regulations.gov and then the keyword there. And then hopefully have a proposed rule for the shark season rule by November, December. So, and that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Guy. At this time, are there any questions on the presentation? Gary.
Thank you, Guy. What is the process or the trigger for reevaluating a shark position on the ABC rule tier? And is there like a set reevaluation schedule based on CDAR assessments, or how does that work?
Thanks. Yeah, so right now there's no set schedule. It's mostly based on the data from that SOC assessment, how we place them in the tiers. Right now we're taking comment on the placement of our shark species within each of the tier structure. But we've kind of put out there that, a few of them are in the data rich, some are in data moderate. And unfortunately, majority of our shark stocks are in the no accepted assessments. So we would have to wait for an assessment, whether done through CDAR or externally, that's been reviewed for moving forward.
I've got kind of a follow-up, if that's okay. Is there an option to use alternative data years that align with significant management or policy changes to determine the ABC other than the 5-10?
Yeah, that's something that can be done, because I know we've changed quite a few of our shark regulations in the past 10, 15 years. and how the fishery is going to operate in the near future with some of the external factors that are affecting them. We can look at more recent years or go back to a certain point when the fishery changed to forward. I think it could be overall for all of our shark stocks, or it could be based on individual management groups. So if we've changed the large coastal fishery in the past 5 years, maybe just go to the past 5 years. But if small coastals, say it was like 10, 15 years ago, maybe go to that point or more recent. So we can be flexible and take comment on what years of data we should be using.
Yes, John.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Guy. Just could you give a little more detail on what's going on with sandbar sharks? Why there seems to be such a decrease in the number of permits?
The big thing is the market, because we don't, for the shark research fishery, whatever money for the research fishery, whatever they make is what they can sell the product for. So we're not paying those fishermen historically to go out shark fishing. And the markets just haven't quite been there. And unfortunately, some of the fishermen, and now with some of the different regulations between CITES and then National Fin Ban, they're just, the value is not there anymore. So this year we only had, I think, 3 applicants, and we took three. But historically, we've been taking 5 to 10 in the past. So unfortunately, just the interest has not been there.
And the next hand I saw was Roy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In your scoping document, this is more of a comment than a question. I'll be interested to see how you address topics that are and seem to be coming from the opposite ends of the spectrum. In other words, I'm thinking about the depredation. How do you decrease depredation, while the very next item in your list was additional protection? How do you see that working out, where there seem to be opposing approaches to address these problems?
Yeah, thanks. That's a tough one. We're stuck in the middle. But based on the science that we have for each one of the assessments, we can set quotas that are appropriate for that stock, and then we'd have management measures appropriate for them, each one. I know depredation, we're getting such a range of shark species that are potential culprits for those. I mean, sandbar, we're hearing a lot of sandbar and duskies. Duskies prohibited, sandbars are really on the shark research fishery. But some of the options we have in our document is like, okay, if no one's participating in a shark research fishery, maybe we can allow sandbar quota or retention outside the research fishery on a limited basis too. So it's just, it really comes down to the science and what the ABCs and ACLs can be for each one of the stocks. And then we'd set management measures appropriately.
Yes, Gary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it looks like the recreational and the commercial OFL and ABC, ACL take into consideration discards. Do you have a concern because there's a large amount of uncertainty around the discard data that using it could result in more conservative quotas, which would restrict the fishery more than is necessary?
I think that would depend on the shark stock. Example is, with the blacktip shark in the Atlantic, the scientific certainty for that species is much lower than other species. So we're pretty confident in some of those data as compared to some of the other shark species. But I think it really comes down to individual species individually to get a better sense of that one.
And I saw Lewis with his hand up.
I'm just wondering if you could comment regarding blacktips in the Gulf. I know they're having difficulty with reaching their quota everywhere else, but it seems like that blacktip quota, which is fairly substantial, goes quickly every year. And what's the difference on marketability?
So chatting with some of the fishermen dealers in the area, they have a window of when they go shark fishing, usually beginning of the year, and then during this, the British holiday of Lent, and they export those products to Mexico. So there's a big market for them in that area. So that's why they kind of go through their quota really fast at the beginning of the year and kind of target them. But then they move on to other things. And that's what we've been hearing from a lot of our fishermen. They have a diverse portfolio, and they kind of look at what's available and what's more profitable for them to be jumping into. So yeah, and black tips are kind of, the quota is going to be pretty large in the Gulf potentially for that species. So and that's just based on their reproductive cycles and biology.
All right, I'm not seeing other hands for questions. Thank you for answering them, Guy. The decision before the board now is to determine whether we'd like to send a letter during scoping for this amendment. Is there any interest in sending a letter? All right, I'm not going to twist anyone's arm. I will note Florida FWC will be submitting a letter to comment on it.
Thank you.
So, the next item of business is a review of the fishery management plan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. These are the sections in the F&P review report that you received in materials, but in the interest of time, I'll just touch briefly on each of these. So the coastal sharks F&P was implemented in 2009. There have been 5 addenda that modified the F&P. The F&P and addenda do not include any coastal shark monitoring or research requirements. And the commission typically follows the lead of NOAA Fisheries Highly Migratory Species, HMS, when setting the quotas and closures for shark. Since last year, there haven't been any changes to the stock status of any of the managed shark species, and the most recent stock assessment was for Atlantic blacktip, and it found Atlantic blacktip not overfished and not subject to overfishing. And as was mentioned, there's an ongoing management track assessment for the HMS Hammerhead Sharks Group through CDAR 77. Commercial landings of aggregated large coastal shark species in 2021 were less than 181,000 pounds dressed weight, and that's roughly a 20% decrease from 2020 landings. Commercial landings of small coastal shark species in 2021 were 246,932 pounds, which is about a 5% increase from the 2020 landings. And commercial landings of Atlantic pelagic sharks in 2021 were greater than 84,850 pounds, which represents an approximate 14% decrease from 2020. This graphic is showing the recreational harvest of sharks, where large coastal sharks and small coastal sharks are shown in numbers, and those are represented by the red and blue bars. And pelagic shark data are reported in metric tons, whole weight, and that is shown by the gray line. So in 2021, recreational harvest for large coastal sharks and small coastal sharks both increased relative to 2020. And for pelagic sharks, the recreational harvest decreased in 2021 relative to 2020. In 2021, recreational harvest of prohibited Atlantic shark species was 58 sharks, and that's the lowest value that it's been over the last 5 years. And then this F&P, again, doesn't establish specific de minimis guidelines that would exempt a state from regulatory requirements contained in the plan, but de minimis can be determined on a case-by-case basis. This year, Massachusetts has requested continued de minimis status for aggregated large coastal and hammerhead species groups with regard to the possession limit and the closure requirement. The PRT reviewed the de minimis request and the recent data, and they recommend de minimis status be granted to Massachusetts for the aggregated large coastal and hammerhead species groups. As an update from last year, the PRT noted that New Jersey has now implemented the non-offset circle hook requirements for the recreational fishery as of February 2023. And then lastly, the PRT noted that in 2021, Georgia's recreational regulations allowed for the landing of one hammerhead, one shortfin mako, and one other shark, which is in excess of what is allowed under the FMP. Our FMP allows one shark per person per vessel, plus one Atlantic sharpnose and one bonnethead. This issue has been raised with Georgia DNR staff, and they've indicated that the regulations will be updated accordingly. But as of right now, I don't believe those changes have been implemented. Next slide. And then to wrap up, the board action here is just to consider approval of the de minimis request for Massachusetts, the state compliance reports, and approval of the FMP review for the 2021 fishing year. And I can take any questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. Any questions on the FMP review? All right, seeing none, I will open the floor for a motion. Justin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to approve de minimis request from Massachusetts state compliance reports and the Coastal Sharks FMP review for the 2021 fishing year.
Thank you. Is there a second? Second from Roy. All right. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, that's approved by consent. Thank you, Caitlin. Is there any other business to come before the board? Seeing none, I consider this meeting adjourned.